Welcome, everybody. I'm Ashish Kaushal, the founder of Consciously Unbiased, a movement to build inclusion in the workplace, and CEO of a diversity staffing firm called Higher Talent. A few months ago, we started a series with my friend Dr. Plummer, CEO of Onyx Therapy Group. And this is the fourth episode. It's called Know Thyself series, which is basically covering emotional intelligence in the workplace. Our theory is around the fact that to become a good manager and a good coworker, you really need to understand who you are and what your triggers are. And so today's topic is going to be talking about different types of defense mechanisms we all use to recognize themselves in yourself and your colleagues and healthier ways to show up in the workplace. I think becoming aware of our defense mechanisms we use would be a game changer in how we manage our organizations, how we work with each other, and how we become more productive. I came across this article on defense mechanisms. We're going to drop it in the chat message or in the comments. And I had my whole team do the exercise on their own, and I asked them not to share it with me or anyone else, just so they could be real honest with themselves and basically write how they used what each defense mechanism meant and how they used it in their own personal lives. And so basically write 2 pages on that over the course of 2 weeks, because it's about 14 or 20 defense mechanisms. And so through that, it's really helped our own organization sort of get along with each other better, and because we're all understanding where we're coming from. And then you also realize, like, oh shoot, I do that. There's a word for this. So it's not just me, and there's other people in society that have that. And so I think that was very powerful. So as we start this series again, welcome everybody. And Dr. Plummer, welcome back.
Hey, how are you?
Good. How are you? Good to see you.
I'm good. This summer has been treating me real well. So I feel real relaxed. I also use like an elliptic. You know how you have eucalyptus as aromatherapy? Mm-hmm. And I am chilling.
Love it. So let's start with the basics. What is defense mechanism exactly, and how do they work?
Yeah, absolutely. So defense mechanisms are a term that came up from Freud, Sigmund Freud, who people consider as to be the father of psychology. That's controversial because psychology, the way we know it, originated in Europe, but there were many practices of psychology that were around the world, right? Mm-hmm. But Sigmund Freud is considered the father. And we all know about like his psychosocial model, right? Like oral stages, anal stages, phallic stages, etc. But we also sometimes use some of his other terms in a layman kind of way. So we use like consciousness or unconsciousness or subconsciousness. With this, Freud, in his development of the mind, his theory around development of the mind, he said that we operate with our id, which is the raw part of who we are, right? Then we have our ego, and that's a term that we're going to talk about a bit today because it's oftentimes misused from a psychological perspective. People just say ego, but they're not necessarily understanding what that means. And then there's the super ego, which is where we have our morals and our values as a matter of development. So you have the id, which is really raw. You have the ego, which is what people tend to see because that's where your personality is. And then you have your super ego, which is where your morals and your values are. And people don't always see those unless your morals or values get challenged, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
So if we stay with this ego, the purpose of the ego is to regulate the id. So it's this idea that you can't be raw all the time. So you got to show up in a way that's a bit more presentable. And that becomes part of your personality. Out of the ego comes the defense mechanisms. So the ego is, again, in this middle part. It's this middle part of who we are, the core of who we are, if you will. And whenever our ego is getting challenged, that's when we develop our defense mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So our ego is supposed to keep us kind of balanced, because if we are always too raw, that becomes problematic. And if we are always more like just set on our morals, that also becomes rigid, right? Mm-hmm. Because you ever met a person that was like so morally based and you're like, relax, like it's okay. It wasn't even about that, right?
Yeah.
The ego keeps us balanced. The ego is also, like I mentioned, where our personality lies. But the tricky part about the ego is that part of it is conscious and part of it is subconscious. Mm-hmm. There's a great image of the ego, id, ego, and super ego as an iceberg. The id is low. Nobody knows the id. You experience it, but it's also in your subconscious or your unconscious. So you're not even always aware.
Mm-hmm.
Ego, part of it is on top of the ice, and part of it is below. And then the super ego is mostly on top, but some of it is low.
Mm-hmm.
So the ego is part of what people see, but there's parts of the ego that we're not even consciously aware of because it's in our subconscious or maybe even in our unconsciousness. So when something happens to what we are experiencing, we go into this defensive mechanism. We rely on a defensive mechanism to protect ourselves. The problem is that sometimes we protect ourselves when we actually aren't under attack, or sometimes we protect ourselves when we actually need to be responding from a place of vulnerability, and not from a place of defensiveness. So in the workplace, the defense mechanisms are not necessarily bad, especially if you're aware of them,
Yeah.
and you're also aware of your triggers. So having a defense mechanism is not bad. It's actually a good thing because you don't want to always just accept, like you want to be able to process what's going on and think about it.
So two things I'm going to ask on that. One is, what do you say when people say I have no ego?
I say, okay, girl. Yes, sir. All right. If that's what you think. I think what they mean by that is that they don't operate comfortable. They don't generally operate in a place of defensiveness. So when they're like, I don't have any ego, I think what they're trying to say is, I lean more into openness and understanding as opposed to defensiveness. But again, that's because people are misusing ego. Ego is not a bad thing.
Mm.
The problem is that we have taken the word ego and made it into essentially defense mechanisms. And so we're like, your ego is too big and you're too proud. And those things are not what an ego is.
I always thought when people
it's
say,
a balancer. Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean, I always thought when people say I don't have an ego, I'm like, oh boy, we're going to go into a lot of stubbornness here.
Right. And when people say they don't have an ego, they usually do have an ego. So they're either going to be way too open or they're going to be way too stubborn, like you mentioned. And I know myself. And I love when people know themselves. We've talked about in previous LinkedIn lives about people being aware. That's a major thing. One of the things that people need to be aware about in themselves is their particular defense mechanism. So just like we talked about communication a couple months ago, now here we are talking about increasing your awareness around your defense mechanism and not being ashamed of it, because we all have defense mechanisms. Some people have multiple defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
But what is important is to understand how that became your particular defense mechanism, because there's likely a trigger associated with that. So anytime you get triggered, then the defense mechanism is going to come out, and it may not always be appropriate. It may be better to acknowledge the trigger and do some processing as opposed to as opposed to be triggered and just become defensive.
So, I mean, why do people have defense mechanisms in the first place?
Yeah, just as a way of protecting themselves, because they feel like a part of their personality has been called to the rug, if you will, or a part of their personality is being challenged. Remember, the connection with ego is our personality. That's what people see, right? That's part of the consciousness of the ego. But because people misuse the term ego, they usually mean a defense mechanism, then they try to avoid that, right? Like, I don't really have a big ego. But we have an ego. Everybody has an ego, especially according to the Freudian theory, of which I do appreciate, right? I'm more of a cognitive person, but I appreciate Freud, and it's great to be able to see the world through that theory as well. So egos are fine, and defense mechanisms are fine too. It's just a matter of being aware of that particular defense mechanism and how you use it and when you use it. If you're always projecting, then that becomes problematic. But if you're projecting because that's your way of defending yourself, and then you're aware of it, you can go back and apologize. If you are always have regression, or you always have a repressive defense mechanism. Okay, but we're going to be aware of it so that we could later take that defense mechanism and whatever triggered that particular defense mechanism to process it.
It's funny, when I first graduated college, I worked at Accenture. When they did the interview process, they're like, we can teach you any like technical skill or how to work on something, but we can't teach you how to deal with human behavior. And so we're testing for that when we bring you in, because you're going to be seeing clients. And so, like, one of the examples I would use, and that's one of the reasons they hired me probably, is because if I knew that you don't like to be controlled or told what to do, rather than saying, hey, can you get this done, I will ask you a series of questions to make it your idea. Right. And so that's, I think the way this kind of applies in corporate America is, if I understand your defense mechanisms and you understand mine, then we know how to communicate a little bit better. And you brought up how you talked about the ego and the id, and one of the things that's really been kind of annoying me in the D&I talks is bringing authentic self to work. And I'm like, you have to put context around that, because I don't even bring that to my mom. And so you have to, like, you don't want to bring your raw self every day. You need to like moderate it based on where you are, but you should feel safe enough that you can be honest about things that are bothering you and not have a massive impact in your
that's why people need to have an ego, because remember that ego is that balancing act, right? So it's that, and if my friend, I don't know if one of my best friends is watching, named Nikki, she always uses the word balance. She's a Libra, and I'm like, girl, stop using the word balance. But because I'm a harmony person, but it's just the way we tease, right? But ego really does keep everything in its place, right? And it is part of our personality. Again, what I really want people to walk away with understanding is that people are often using the word ego when they mean defense mechanism, right? Because defense mechanism is part of the ego. We need to stop using that because it's confusing people. We should have an ego. We should have a balancing act. We should be able to show our personality. That's a good thing. We need to just have it regulated so that we can still be productive. So in the workplace, it's important to know, as leaders, it's important to know your staff members' communication style, which we talked about a couple months ago. But it's also important for you to understand their defense mechanisms, because oftentimes when a person becomes defensive, if somebody says something to me, one of my defense mechanisms historically has been I always mess it up. I intellectualize. And that makes sense because I'm a clinical therapist, right? So I will take what people are saying, and I'm also a Virgo, but I will take what people are saying and I'll put a clinical spin on it, which keeps me from accessing my emotions, and I stay in my logic, right? If I do that and a person is looking for an emotional response from me and they're looking for some kind of connection or some compassion, and I respond with intellectualizing what they said, they're then going to become defensive also, and they're going to get into their defense mechanism, and then you're going to have two people that are defensive, right? And there's no productivity that can come from that. One of us has to step back, and in my opinion, the person who should step back and analyze and pay attention is the leader. We've talked to Ashish about the fact that many leaders nowadays don't go through actual leadership training. They just keep getting promoted. And defense mechanisms should be part of leadership training. Communication should be part of leadership training. Understanding at least the basics of human behavior should be part of leadership development, not just getting promoted because you're really good at doing some task, right? That just means you're really good at doing some tasks. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are equipped to lead people.
Absolutely. What are some of the common defense mechanisms that you see in a workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all the defense mechanisms show up in the workplace. Freud generally started off with about 12 defense mechanisms, but now we're seeing the emergence of other defense mechanisms as more theorists are taking a Freudian theoretical perspective and adding it to what we see currently in life. So the historical defense mechanisms are like repression, rationalization, projection, displacement, denial, intellectualization, reaction formation, sublimation. And so in all of those, it shows up differently. So for instance, if you're regressing, and I wrote some of my notes here from as I am teaching this to students, if you're regressing, you generally have, if you're repressing, you're taking something and you're pushing it into the subconscious. So those are people who maybe they get into an argument or something at work, and all of us a week later, they're like, somebody brings it up and they're like, oh, I forgot. Sometimes people actually forget, and sometimes people have repressed it. So they pushed it down, and they pretend as if it not pretend, it's actually psychological. So they have pushed it away to the degree that the action is likely going to come back again because it was never addressed, right?
Mhm.
So people
Yeah.
repress. In a lot of office settings or professional settings, you have people that have an intellectualization defense mechanism. So and that's because in our society we have told people to be more logical than emotional.
Yeah.
And when you intellectualize or you rationalize, you are using more of your logical part of your brain than your emotional part of your brain. The emotional part is what has made you intellectualize, but that is the defense mechanism is to remove the emotions completely and just talk about it as if it's clinical, like completely objective. I'll tell you that like I mentioned has been my defense mechanism, and it actually doesn't work. People are like, oh, but that's the great thing to do in the workplace, and of course I get celebrated for being logical all the time and things like that. But sometimes people need an emotional response too. They
Mhm.
need to be able to say, you really get what I'm saying, you really feel what I'm saying, you really see me, right? We also oftentimes say that people want to be seen and they want to be heard, and that's also from an emotional perspective. So the defense, knowing that you have that defense mechanism, whatever the defense mechanism is important, because as soon as you start to do it, you can say, okay, what triggered me
Mhm.
to use this defense mechanism? And then you don't focus on the defense mechanism per se, you focus on what that trigger is.
Sure. No, that makes sense. So there's this fallacy that, like, for example, I might say I'm more aggressive. I'm aggressive at work, but I'm a completely different person at home, right?
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
that's you. I think there's been studies essentially show that you're the same person wherever you are. There might be
Right.
differences. So is that denial or is that rationalization as a defense mechanism when I say that?
It's a lie, but it's not true. It is a fantasy. It is what you want to be the case, right?
Yeah.
But again, that is part of the conditioning that we have in workplaces, where we tell people you have to be this way in the workplace and you can be someplace else, somewhere else.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get the opportunity to modify our behaviors or show up in a particular type of way for an environment. The way you show up at the play for a child, the way you show up at the playground is different than the way that you show up for school, your school
Sure.
lesson, right? So it's
Yeah.
okay to modify those behaviors. But when people say that, they generally really believe it. And that means that a part of them is repressed, or a
Mhm.
part of them has been pushed to the side. They are not allowing that part of them to show up in the world, right? Which is anti authenticity, right? And
Right.
that becomes problematic, because whenever you have to deny yourself, not balance yourself like the ego does, but whenever you have to deny yourself of who you actually are, it will start to plant a seed of mental illness,
Mhm.
because you feel like you can't fully be who you are in every place, and that part of you has to be denied, and that never feels good, right? Especially because, again, people want to be seen and heard. There maybe, for instance, maybe people curse when they're at home and they don't curse at work. That doesn't mean that they're not being themselves. It means they're modifying a particular behavior
Mhm.
um, for a particular location. You're not cursing at work, you're probably not cursing at church or at the synagogue or at the masjid either, but you just making modifications based off of the setting.
So let's go back to this whole. You said something interesting. You said the denial actually is usually the seed of the foundation for mental health issues. Can you talk?
Well, the denial of self, not necessarily the denial as a defense mechanism, but
Yeah.
anytime that you have to deny who you truly are in
Mhm.
any environment, it becomes the root of mental health. The challenge of that is bigger than work. There are people who we were just teasing, right? Right before we came on about the Barbie movie. There are people who will deny themselves in a relationship because they think that because that is what society says that you have to do. We find
Mhm.
this in situations where maybe a woman has been conditioned to be submissive, when in actuality, she's quite bold. So she's constantly fighting herself. And that constant fight will cause an emotional fatigue, which will make one vulnerable to mental illness, to the onset of a mental illness. So anytime we're having these internal fights and not around our id and our ego and our super ego, but the internal fights around, can I be authentic? Can I be loved in this? Can I be seen? Can I be appreciated? At work, we don't use words like love. We use words like appreciation, right?
Yeah.
Can I be appreciated? Oh, if I do this for my boss, then they'll appreciate me, but it means I can't be truly who I am. That becomes problematic. And then we see people saying it's a toxic environment. I think we talked a while ago, Ashish, that some environments are toxic and some environments are uncomfortable, and the two are not always the same. And some people are toxic and some people just motivate you to grow. And the two are not the same. You have to really sit. And from my perspective, you sit with a therapist and you really figure that out. Maybe even a life coach. Onyx is about to start doing some coaching. And I'm excited about that. But we want to be delicate with that because coaching is different from counseling, right? And we need to really understand what a person needs.
Yeah. Are there certain defense mechanisms managers use more than interns?
I can't say that for sure, Ashish. I think that people use I think what I believe and what I have seen is that people who are in leadership positions use defense mechanisms like intellectualizing or rationalizing. And we also see them using defense mechanisms like displacement or projection, right? Projection is, I feel a certain way. It is, you, Ashish, you have offended me and I feel a certain way. I am hurt. And instead of saying I am hurt, I say, Ashish, you're hurt. That's why you offended me, because you're hurt. No, I, Linnell, am hurt. You were not hurt, right? So it's easier for somebody to say, Ashish, you are hurting because the vulnerability is now on you, versus me saying, Ashish, I am hurting. That hurt me, right? And so as people grow into their careers, they start to use defense mechanisms that are far more logical based than emotional based. And that's just because of the way culture of professional offices and build, because of this idea of professionalism. If I'm professional, I have to be this way. If I'm professional, I can't have an emotion. If I'm professional, everything has to be logical. And so they start using more of those defense mechanisms. The root of that is a learned behavior. Our general defense mechanisms are generally formed in our childhood, though. So it's based off of who our parents told us to be. So if my parents said, hey, Linnell, you can't be all emotional all the time, right? Nobody wants an emotional Black girl around, right? Because we get pigeonholed as angry. Instead, think through all of this and tell me how you feel through your thoughts, right? Sometimes that works, but if you do that too often, it becomes a defense mechanism of rationalization. And so knowing the defense mechanism is important because it shows you how to move forward at work, but knowing it is also important because it'll show you what part of your childhood or your learning needed to be adjusted. It doesn't mean you go back and be mad at your parents like you screwed me over, because they did the best that they could. Many parents, I believe, do the best they can. Not all, but many. But it means like that is the defense mechanism that you have. So now you analyze it so you can pay attention to the trigger, and then you pay attention to when it shows up so that you can modify.
So, one of the defense mechanisms we just talked about, projection, is one of my pet peeves, honestly. Like when somebody says, I know this is how you're feeling, I'm like, no, you don't know how I'm feeling. This is how you feel. Like you deciding how I feel is like not suited in reality. In the workplace, so do you think this defense mechanism is sort of the foundation? Like, why do people project so much at work and come up with conspiracy theories and like what's happening when it's not really rooted in reality?
I think because people don't want to ask questions. Because when you ask a question, you open yourself up to vulnerability, because it means that there's something you don't know. So we have gotten more accustomed to and comfortable with making an assumption and kind of just hoping that we're right. I was about to say like a crapshoot, right? Like you're playing or playing dice or something. Like
Yeah.
you're just hoping that it's right.
Yeah.
But it shows up that way because we are afraid to ask questions. And the higher we go in leadership, the more people are afraid to be vulnerable, because because there's this thought that if they are vulnerable, then they will get fired. If they're vulnerable, it means that they're paying more attention to humans as opposed to the product and the productivity. And so more intellectualizing defense mechanisms show up, and people ask less questions. And so they become more ignorant when it comes to human behavior and observation, and more problematic when it comes to being a leader.
Okay. That makes
So
sense.
I don't like to use a lot of negative language because people they don't always take away the positive in that. What I am saying is that more leaders should be learning how to be leaders. More leaders should be asking questions, and it should become part of the culture to lean into questions as opposed to leaning into assumptions.
So that's interesting, because one of the other things we do with like interview process training with our clients is, if they're trying to get rid of the bias in the interview process, I'm like, just like a little child, just go back to your manager and ask why they rejected them, and ask them 5 times. And if they can get through the 5th one, then they really didn't want that person. But if they can't, the next time they're not going to do that, because they know that you're not going to be able to BS them.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
But so going back to this conspiracy theory or whatever that weaves into an organization because of the drama that it creates, what are some tools and exercises people can do to become more conscious of the defense mechanisms they use to sort of disband this sort of situation?
I don't even know why you're asking me the question. You started off by saying that you guys did an activity over there at Consciously Unbiased. What activity did y'all do?
We did the link on overcoming your defense mechanisms by recognizing them yourself.
See, so the information is out there. The worksheets are out there. The prompts are out there. I was looking at some of my old notes, and I have one from when I was doing work with the military, and I gave out examples and things like that, right? So like the best way that people can understand their defense mechanisms, one, is to go to therapy. But right, you're probably like, there goes Linnell again talking about therapy, but go to therapy. But if you are not ready to go to therapy, then go and just Google like defense mechanisms or defense mechanisms examples, or defense mechanism assessments or defense mechanisms evaluations, right? Because they're going to give you examples. Like there's lots of mental health people that are coming up with some really great tools for people to use. I don't like for people to do those independently per se, because it opens up wounds that they're not always ready to process. Like when you realize that you've always had to use the placement as a defense mechanism because your parents were never, so when you were angry with your parents, they never allowed you to say that you had a feeling. So you've instead took it out on your dog or took it out on your younger sibling. So you've gotten conditioned with displacing, right?
That sounds like making him a serial killer.
It is. I used to study serial killers. That's what I wanted to do before I became a therapist. I wanted to be a forensic psychologist, studying serial killers. They're fascinating to me. But when there's ways that you can find your defense mechanisms. You just have to be careful in doing it independently, because if it opens up a wound and you're not ready to deal with that or to process it, or you don't have a space to really talk about it, then it becomes more problematic. Now you're aware and you feel lonely because you can't do anything with that awareness. Or you get afraid and then you end up repressing it, or you fall very much heavy into displacement. Displacement is also one of those defense mechanisms that we see in the workplace. But that's not generally with the leaders, is usually with the staff. So say a leader says something that upsets a staff member, because the staff member may be afraid to respond or to say like, that really hurt me, or to say, that wasn't fair. they may instead go and take it out on their coworker. You know, the coworker doesn't refill the coffee machine or something, and they're like, "You never pay attention. You don't care about us. You're a horrible person," and they take it out on the coworker as opposed to what they really feel and uncomfortable with is the leader. So when we go back, and hopefully people will go back and watch the LinkedIn Live on communication and communication styles, one of the things that people need to do is that as they become defensive, they need to understand who they're about to talk to so that they understand that person's communication style along with their communication style so that both can be heard. But again, in our particular US based society, everything moves so fast that people don't give themselves time to acknowledge that they've been heard, acknowledge that they are using a defense mechanism, time to acknowledge what communication styles are, and use the proper one. And that, I think that's problematic in our society. We're like a popcorn society, a fast food society, meaning that everything has to be in terms of immediate gratification as opposed to delayed gratification.
And talking points, right?
Yeah.
Like bite-sized talking points without the knowledge behind it.
Yeah.
So this has been awesome. What's one small step, or what would you, besides reading around what our defense mechanisms are today, what else would you do that the audience should sort of look at if they really want to take this to the next level? I mean, therapy is definitely important, I think, and there's different types of therapy that is out there. But if you can't afford that, or you're not ready to do that, what else would you recommend people do to sort of help make their work culture better, which will also translate at home if you're the same person on both sides?
Because you are the same person on both sides.
Yeah.
I love talking with you, Ashish. You make me laugh. And then we get to have these wonderful conversations. I think, so I recognize, I'm sounding really clinical today, but I recognize that everybody has their different learning styles. There's a theory from Gardner called multiple intelligences, right? And so some people learn by reading, some people learn by doing, some people learn by talking, some people learn, by listening, whatever the case may be, which is why the US education system is kind of messed up, because everybody doesn't learn by listening and talking. It's like 8 different ways that we learn, multiple intelligences. So with that, my go-to is to say, go and do an activity, right? Because that becomes kinesthetic. Go and read something, go and talk about it with someone, go and process it. And the someone doesn't always have to be a therapist. Sometimes it can be a friend that's close to you, or a spouse if you don't often find yourself in if you feel comfortable all the time with your spouse, because some people don't, they're just married, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable. So make sure that you find the way that you learn the best, and you start to learn the defense mechanisms, because a large part of our defense mechanisms are in the subconscious, meaning that it is accessible, but we have to work to get to it. We have to actually work to get to these defense mechanisms. We can't just assume. We have to do something in order to learn about ourselves. And that's why therapy tends to help, because there's activities in therapy, there's reflections, there's like journaling, there's conversations. Depending on your therapist, you guys may be outside and dislodging some of the things in your mind and your brain. So I believe that people have to learn their learning style, and they have to learn these defense mechanisms.
So you gave me 2 thoughts. One is that anything worth doing requires active steps. So if you want to improve something, anything that's free or passive, it's not going to make a big impact in your life. And then number 2 is you give me an idea for our next one. If you're open to doing another one, is maybe we should talk about the way we learn and the way we listen.
Yeah, let's do it. I love that. So even when I'm teaching with my students, I'm oftentimes asking them about their learning styles. And my students, from my evaluations at least, they really love me because I don't just lecture, because a lot of people don't want to just sit and listen to a lecture, right? They want to do something, they want to talk to somebody else, They want to move around. I've done activities where my students are moving around the whole building, where I have a lesson on this hallway and a lesson on that hallway, and then they have to come back and talk, because some people are kinesthetic, right?
Mhm.
So we could absolutely talk about these multiple intelligences, the way that people listen and the way that people learn and the way that people do, because those are also important. You ever had a coworker or a staff member who couldn't sit still, and you would see them at somebody else's desk, and
Mhm.
people are like, all you do is chit chat all day. But what they're doing is probably talking about something related to work, and then they come back, they do something real quick, and then they go and talk to somebody else. They're probably more kinesthetic, right? Or they're probably more interpersonal. They're not just gonna sit and be at a computer all day. The other thing, I know you didn't ask this question, Ashish, but the other thing is that some people, many adults, when we were growing up, I think you and I are in the same generation. I consider myself an Xer.
Mhm. Me
And
too.
so when we were growing up, we didn't really have a term for ADHD, right? It wasn't something that we used. And so now many people in our generation are saying, I have adult ADHD. It is a pet peeve of mine when people diagnose themselves, because I'm
Me
like,
too.
I don't know. But what is likely to be happening is that they're in a workspace or an environment that doesn't allow them to work the way that is comfortable for them. I see
Yeah.
that a lot with kinesthetic learners who are forced to sit at work,
Mm.
as opposed to being able to get up and to move. Even simple things like the bouncy balls, we used to use them for ab balls. If you give that to a person instead of a still chair, that helps them to focus too, because they're moving during the process, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, because we didn't have that language when we were younger, some adults really do have adult ADHD, and some adults are kinesthetic learners, interpersonal learners, and they're in an environment that doesn't support that type of learning.
Mhm.
And oftentimes they feel insecure about that because our education system makes kids sit to learn as opposed to move to learn. That's why a lot of kids like PE because they get to move around when they're learning. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this is awesome. I'm excited about our next one. So I think where I want to leave this is you talked about you're launching a life coaching thing in
Yeah.
August, right? I'm going to rebrand it. So if I wanted to use your services, I'm going to call it work coaching.
Okay.
Where could we find out more about this?
Yeah, in my mind. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sure my team is watching right now. They're like, girl, are you really about to do this? And part of it is because I redid our strategic plan in June, and it was one of the things that I wanted to add. But I had to be really careful about it. And so when I'm on vacation, I'm able to think really creatively because I
Yeah.
don't have to do like the normal task. Nonetheless, I'm ready to do coaching, but I want to do it the Onyx way, because again, some coaches are bringing in mental health and they're not qualified to do that, right?
Sure.
It's kind of like a basketball coach. They can't sit there and be like, you missed that shot because you got poor insecure attachment style. Like, what? That is not what this is, right? Like, you can't do that. And there's a part of counseling that allows for coaching, and that's in our behavioral, based off of our behavioral theory. So counselors can coach, but all coaches can't counsel. And so I want to make sure that the coaches that we bring into Onyx are really clear about the lane that they're going to be in, and that they
Yeah.
don't step over. And because there's not a full accreditation body for coaching, anybody can say that they're a coach, and that's not
Totally.
true. So our interview process for coaching is going to be very much more strict. If anybody wants to find out about the coaching that we're going to be doing at Onyx, or our counseling services, or our educational consulting services, or our professional development services, or whatever, because we do a lot over here, they can go to the website, and it's onyxtherapygroup.com. So ONYX therapygroup.com. Or they can follow us on LinkedIn. They can follow us on IG. And if they want more information, they can simply put my name into a Google search and see all of the articles and stuff, and the websites, the podcast, because I like to do this type of teaching to the masses in terms of like, what is mental health, what are defense mechanisms, what are coping mechanisms versus protective mechanisms, because sometimes people think that they're coping. And if you're coping all the time, then it means that you have to change your protective mechanisms. Coping mechanisms, if you're always coping, you're probably running on E and will get exhausted, and that makes you more susceptible to mental illness. So we have to change by being more protective in the day. So I like teaching about things like this because people walk away and they're like, oh, I learned something new. They apply it to their lives and they see change. And that matters to me. You know, as a therapist, I'm more about micro change, like a couple people changing, as opposed to believing that I'm about to change the world. My daddy says, I think I'm changing the world. I just want to help people, individual people. And those individual people with their purpose may change the world.
Completely. I love it. Well, thank you so much today. Always fun.
Always fun, Ashish. So I guess I'll see you next month. We're going to do this, right?
Definitely.
All right. And by that point, I'm going to have had a new birthday. Okay?
That's true. Happy birthday.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. I'll see you later, Ashish.
Bye.
Bye.